At the first glance, Asian cities seem chaotic and not at all beautiful. However, if you've had an opportunity to live in one for a couple of years, like me, then you may have gotten to know their own distinct charms. It is to some extent a matter of expectation. If you bite into coriander expecting to taste parsley, you may find it quite horrible at first. This is what happened to me when I first moved to Taiwan at the age of 10, and that was when I first tasted coriander. Expectations often form a kind of background logic to what we find desirable and attractive and what we do not. So what is the logic behind finding Asian cities beautiful? In this video, I will talk about two prominent features of Asian cities. Firstly, shadows, and secondly, chaos. In his essay In Praise of Shadows from the 70s, Junichiro Tanizaki explains Japanese aesthetics. He says that compared to Western aesthetics, Japanese really crave the shadows. He appreciates dimly lit toilets, dark, shady houses with impenetrable corners of darkness, and especially cool, dark Japanese temples enveloped in layers upon layers of darkness. He says, as a general matter, we find it hard to be really at home with things that shine and glitter. Rather, he prefers the beauty in the shadows, not the thing itself, but the shadows and patterns it creates. He comments, for instance, on the old East Asian practice of blackening the teeth among women. While in the West, women strive to have as white teeth as possible. In Japan and Vietnam and a few other places in Asia, there was this old practice of darkening the teeth and showing this really black smile. But he says we have to see this in a context. Japanese houses and alleys and mansions were veiled in shadows, so the dark teeth had a very different aesthetic than they would in the plain, bright sunlight. He says he knows nothing more enchanting than the face of a young girl in the wavering shadow of a lantern, her teeth now and then as she smiles shining in a lacquered black through lips like elfin fires. He then talks about this aesthetics of shadows in the context of architecture and city building. He says, in making for ourselves a place to live, we first spread a parasol to throw a shadow on the earth, and in the pale light of the shadow, we put together a house. So the shadow is not the accidental byproduct of the constructed object that casts a shadow. Rather, it seems that it's the opposite. The shadow comes first, and the shadow demarcates the space where the house is then built. But of course, if you look at Japanese cities today, they're probably some of the most well-lit and light-polluted areas in the world. And Tanizaki acknowledges this. He says, though, that it's part of this effort of Japan to keep up with Europe and with the West, and it's not inherently part of Asian culture. Now, you may have noticed how Tanizaki speaks in first-person plural. We Asians, we Orientals, he says even. And this is quite a dated tendency because he defines Asianness kind of as the other of the West, as if the West were the benchmark for the norm for how people are, and he had to justify and explain Asianness from the perspective of the West. And this is a tendency that Edward Said has criticized as orientalizing. People used to and still sometimes do describe the Orient as a kind of a mysterious, exotic place that is completely different from realities in the West. And this is quite dangerous because it can lead to exploitation of these places and people, as was the case in the colonial times. Many of the colonial powers justified their pursuits by saying that the Orientals don't care for material goods and that they're spiritual, mysterious, exotic. And that is why the West can come in and just enjoy their resources because they don't mind. They're different from us. So that's how the kind of justification of colonialism used to go. But still, we can appreciate some of these distinct qualities of Asian cities and Asian cultures, not from the perspective of them being different from the West, but rather in their own right. This takes me to chaos, the second feature I want to talk about that I like about Asian cities. So here we have to be careful as well, because chaos was also used in orientalizing discourses to justify kind of the exploitation of Asian places, because colonial powers would say there's only chaos and a mess, and we can come and bring civilization to these people, and they should be grateful for that. So here I'm doing my utmost to avoid these kind of orientalizing discourses and to focus by contrast on what may cause this kind of image of the urban jungle in Asian cities. If you take a stroll down the streets of Taipei or Bangkok or Mumbai, there is no predetermined way how your day will go. It's just that serendipitous. It's just that vibrant and unpredictable. It's kind of like in kung fu movies, where the fight takes the protagonists around little alleyways and onto unpredictable scenery, and they suddenly end up in some kind of warehouse with stacked goods where they can use the walls to kind of push off and fight in the vertical axis and so on. Ho and Chalana describe the experience of Asian cities as follows. Nothing suggests whether one is indoors or outdoors, in a private space or a public space, daytime or evening. No apparent spatial or visual order seems to exist. Nothing stands still. So if you grew up in Europe or in America, you're used to kind of a linear order to the city, to blocks, to geometrical spaces. In Asia, linear orders are considered ugly. And this may have something to do with the fact of how our scripts work. So most European countries use the Latin script, which is just written from left to right in one line. And in Asia, for instance, the Japanese kanji script uses a lot of the Chinese characters, and these characters point in all directions. Each character is like a little city in itself, with little clusters of signification, little roots of meaning. And perhaps this logic of arranging space in clusters and little tiny packets of information has translated to urban planning in Asia as well, creating these complex alleyways and narrow pathways and this kind of verticality of spaces. And this kind of characteristic messiness of Asian cities stems from urban informality, as Ho and Chalana explain. So on the one hand, from informal street vendors that just kind of spread out their goods on the street and sell them, but also migrant workers who squat in ancient palaces, for instance, as is the case in Delhi. This kind of unauthorized black market, illegal movings contribute to this fluid quality of Asian cities, in which a street scene will never seem to be the same from one day to the next. Perhaps because of poverty, people are used to improvising, to finding ingenious ways of setting up their shop or making a living or building a home. In Hindi, there's a word for this. It's called jugaad. And Indians are often very proud to be jugaad, to be able to freestyle their way in life. But however, this kind of marveling at ingenuity sometimes borders on poverty porn, and a lot of Western tourists like to kind of go visit these slums in Mumbai and to marvel at how everything works so well in such a poor system, in such a dense environment, and so on. But we would do well to criticize this as well, to say people should not have to be ingenious to just make ends meet and just to survive. And if we're looking for reasons for this ingenuity and informality, we could see it as a kind of resistance to global economy. Having orderly streets and only legal and authorized vendors contributes to kind of a surveyability of the terrain. We have control. And street vendors precisely avoid this kind of control with their unpredictable pattern of setting up shop on the street. So this kind of informality and perceived messiness can also be a sign of an attempt of freedom.